Have you figured out how to grow them yourselves based off that?
Not yet. No, that is a very contentious and hopeful thing for many. I know some people who have found how to grow morels, and I know that Paul Stamets has experimented with that as well, but I also know that those operations have not been sustainable in the sense that morels may come up once and then they won't come up again. So that code has not been cracked yet.
Do you think it's because there is less research in it, or do you think it might not be a possibility?
That's a great question. Well, one of the reasons that we haven't been able to figure out how to cultivate them is that because we don't know what exactly their life strategy is. So are they forming symbiotic relationships with plants? Are they mainly decomposers? And most people think of them as decomposers or saprophytic. And so that's why they might come up after a fire, because there's this flush of nutrients that's been released from wood being burned and the earth being burned. But there are also possibilities that they come up because they were connected with host trees, and the threat of those host trees dying made them do the last chance reproduction cycle to produce these morels to then send out the spores. So because we're not really sure what that life cycle looks like, cultivating it is a whole other question. And what is really interesting about morels is that scientists, including me, think that they might switch their life strategy according to what nutrients are available. So if there's a flush of nutrients from a disturbance, such as wildfire or construction or logging, then they might take advantage of that, versus you can find a morel in a very undisturbed stream bed and think that they could be forming relationships there as well. So the question of how to cultivate morels comes down to how do they survive, and that is not something we've been able to answer yet.
Is the situation between if it's supporting the tree that's been damaged or eating off of ruined nutrients from a fire, is that the similar situation to by the river when it floods and morels come out?
That's a great question. I would say no. I would say that them being by the river isn't really a disturbance, in the sense that if there has been a flood, then I haven't found morels in those kind of situations. I found them in small seasonal stream beds, and that makes me think that they have been around there and might just come with the season. But we mostly see them in disturbed areas, which makes most of us think that the decomposition's life strategy is the preferred one for morels.
Okay. Is this some of what the research you've been doing, is looking at this situation of the disturbance versus not being related to disturbance, or both?
Yes, so morel mushrooms are a very curious family in that they're species, so we have genus. The morel genus, Morchella, is quite expansive with the number of species it has, and there's a lot of contention in the mycology world about which species actually exist. And within that, we usually think about the species as being either in the yellow or the black clade, and fire morels are in the black clade, and that's just simply their coloring. And fire morels are the ones that I have focused on, and because of how they come up after fire. And in Germany, when I was there, I was actually looking more at the yellow clades, so morels that were found. They're also called natural morels, and those were also found in some disturbed sites. But the technique I used to study fire morel mushrooms was an isotopic technique, meaning I looked at carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 isotopes to try to compare their ratios to the surrounding surviving plants and the soil to get an idea where they were getting their nutrients from. And that was different than how I studied the yellow clade mushrooms in Germany, where we were using PCR to try to piece apart if we could find DNA of the morels within the plant roots. And that molecular technique didn't turn out to give us a very good idea of what was happening. But the isotopic technique was one that was replicated by Eric Hobby in New Hampshire, and he has a published paper saying that fire morel mushrooms are most likely decomposers from his research on them in wildfire areas in Washington and Alaska, I believe. In Washington, I know. And I did a similar technique on fire morels in Montana, and though the data has not been published or peer-reviewed, found that they're more likely mycorrhizals. So that is a further indication that they might change life strategies depending on where they are and what environment they're in. But again, these were still fire zones, so it could have just been a slight difference in our research technique. And the big curiosity of like, why is this important? Why understanding the morel life cycle besides cultivation is important? Management that we have around fire morels is just kind of quite, how should I say it, uncertain as to how much harvest can be taken of fire morels. The management is to try to make it so that there's enough fruiting bodies left out that the spores may still travel and maybe reproduce in other areas, but the estimation of how many pounds people can take from certain areas and how frequently is an estimate. And that's because we don't actually know what fire morels are doing on the landscape and how they're doing it. And to not know that means that there's no way of knowing how to sustain that species.
Have you noticed an increase in people picking morels in Montana?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I wouldn't say there's an increase because there's more awareness of morels. I would say there's an increase because there are more people now in Montana. And as people come in, they hear of the legend of fire morels and know to flock post-fire.
Has there been any studies showing maybe a decline in morels due to ways of picking?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
There have not been. There have been some more studies on fire morel prevalence. Yet we're still unsure about what the harvesting techniques, how those may affect the morel populations.
So I know some people like to cut the morel down low versus pulling it up and damaging the mycelium. Do you think that would have an effect?
I think it would, because the mushroom mycelium is the main body mass of a mushroom. So the moldy white threads you see below ground, those condense to form the fruiting body, what we think of as a mushroom, and reproduce. And if you cut it off at the stipe, so the base of the mushroom, then you're preserving that mycelium and allowing it to still survive underground and maybe reproduce in other areas. But if you remove the whole stipe, then you are disrupting that network and not allowing it to reproduce at its same pace or possibly survive. To the degree that it affects the morel populations, I am not sure, and I don't think anyone is. But we know that it's just a small thing to do to try to encourage the existence of morels in areas.
Do you think mycelium in general likes to be disturbed, or does it perform better when it's not been interfered with?
I think mycelium is quite resilient, and if it's interfered with, as you said, that it can still reproduce and expand, but I'm sure to a lesser degree.
Interesting. And then you also studied morels in Nepal, right?
Yeah, they were a small section of my study. So in Nepal, I did several. Mycological studies, but they ranged from. I was there for 10 months, and the first 3 months were wild mushroom season, and that is when I went along the elevation gradient in central Nepal. I did a more ethnomycology study, so understanding how mushrooms relate to people's lives in those areas. And those kind of questions were not only, how often do you harvest and what do you harvest, but what do these mushrooms mean to you? What do you use them for? And mushrooms are so central to many livelihoods in Nepal, which is why I applied to have my Fulbright there, because I had a professor inform me of that. And So within those first 3 months, it was just meeting many and learning about their uses of mushrooms.
Thank you for listening to the Mountains and Mushrooms podcast. The full episode can be found on all the major podcast sites like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, CastBox, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, and Anchor. Ad-free listening and bonus content can be found at patreon.com/mountainsandmushrooms.